Good morning, friends. Will you please pray with me? Gracious God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight. O God, you are our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. The 26th United Nations Conference of Parties Climate Change Conference, or COP26, concluded last week in Glasgow, Scotland. As I was following the coverage, what I found myself noticing was the grief. On signs at protests, in speeches in the streets, in the discourse of diplomacy, in performance art, even at a climate grief karaoke event last Friday night. I'm not making that up. Grief about what has already happened, grief about what's happening right now, grief about what is to come if we don't act. Grief that sorrows at warming temperatures, melting ice, worsening storms, and rising seas, at millions of displaced people, worsening inequality, deepening injustice, a perilous future, the loss of homes and of homelands, imperiled ecosystems, a mass extinction of non-human species, and for some of us, at our own complicity. So many different griefs were pouring out on the streets and in the meeting halls of Glasgow. It's a grief that has become pervasive enough that it has its own name, climate grief. It's a new name, but for me, it is a familiar grief. Before I was a student in Divinity school, I was a scientist. For 25 years, I studied the effects of a warming climate on the forests of the far north. The Alaskan boreal forest, the Siberian taiga. I spent years kneeling before ancient trees, measuring them, listening in a way to their stories of life in a time of climate change. Stories that spoke of an imperiled landscape, that spoke of an imperiled world. There is grief in that kind of work. And I never spoke that grief out loud back then, but I've been thinking about it lately. And I've been thinking about how in paper after paper and grant after grant, I would write some version of the same sentence over and over again. If current trends continue, the sentence would begin, to be followed by a description in dispassionate prose of what would happen if we failed to act. Well, current trends continued. And now here we are awash in grief. And so I've been thinking about those sentences I wrote, and I've been wondering what might have happened if I had found space in the language of science for the language of lament. Because the language of lament has power. The prophet Hosea knows that truth. Hosea's world is also awash in grief. All of creation, in fact, is grieving or languishing or outright perishing. Therefore, the land mourns, and all who live upon it languish. The land mourns. It is a sentence that lands strangely on these 21st century ears of mine. But Mari Jorstad, a brilliant scholar of the Hebrew Bible and author of the book, The Hebrew Bible and Environmental Ethics, invites us to take that sentence seriously. Not literally necessarily, but seriously. The land mourns. Mourning is an outward expression of inward grief, an assertion that grief is not a private affair, but a communal concern. For the ancient Israelites, mourning entailed public lament, marking oneself with ashes, torn clothing. Those outward signs spoke the truth of loss. And they invited compassionate response, neighborly solidarity, a standing with those whose lives were passing through shadowed valleys. And in the Hebrew Bible, mourning is a decidedly expansive practice. The people mourn, but so does the land, so do the deep springs. And so the verb abal, translated here as mourn, also carries the meaning to dry up, to wither. Where we might put ashes on our heads, the land mourns by withering, drawing into itself in an outward show of its inward grief. So to take the land's mourning seriously is to ask about that grief. It is to wonder what truth the land's grief spoke to the people. What truth the land's grief speaks to us. And Hosea gives us a glimpse there in that word, therefore. Therefore, the land mourns. The land mourns because the people have gone astray in all of the familiar ways that people go astray. They have violated their covenant with God. And it's noteworthy and even a little bit remarkable that the land isn't mourning solely for its own sake. It's not grieving pollution or strip mining or any material injury to itself. The land's mourning is wider than that. The land's mourning says that when one part of creation goes awry, the whole suffers. The land's mourning points the people and us to something true about the world, to something deeply hopeful about the world, to the fundamental reality of our interconnection and to the radical truth of our interdependence. Interconnection and interdependence, love and justice, it's the world as it ought to be. That's what the land is mourning. And I imagine that truth looking something like this. And maybe you'll imagine with me for just a moment. So picture yourself from above. You can close your eyes if you'd like. And imagine threads, pick any color you like, running along the ground from you to each of the people in your life on whom you depend, and then from their lives to those on whom they depend. Next, imagine threads, maybe a different color, tracing the path from you to each non-human creature that interacts with your life. Your food, the tree that you smile at every morning, the birds that sing you awake. And then picture threads of yet another color traveling from each of those creatures to all of the creatures on which they depend. Their pollinators, their food, the earthworms that till the soil in which they grow. And finally, imagine some gossamer threads of one more gorgeous hue running from each creature and each human that you are holding in your mind directly to God. If the picture in your head is anything like the one in mine, what you're looking at resembles a fabric. A swath of beautiful, multicolored, homemade, homespun fabric holding our lives, connecting us all, one to the other and all to God. And that fabric represents an ecological truth. It describes the deeply interconnected world that I came to know as an ecologist. And that fabric represents a theological truth, a way of visualizing the world as God made it to be. A relational world, a connected world, an interdependent world. The land's mourning speaks simultaneously of a vision of the world as it ought to be, that beautiful fabric, and the truth of the world as it is, too much injustice and too little love fraying the threads that hold us all. The land feels those fraying threads, the land grieves those fraying threads, and so Hosea insists the land mourns. The land mourns now, too. Now as then, the fabric that connects all of creation is badly torn by manifold injustices wrought and perpetrated by the exploitative systems in which we live, torn by the ways in which ideologies of scarcity teach us to love too narrowly and too little. To mourn is to speak that truth to the lies that prop up the denial on which the status quo depends. And to mourn is also to heal. To participate in the kind of creation-wide lament to which Hosea gives voice is to see in this broken world a reflection, a reminder of the world as it ought to be. It feels a little bit like what Reverend Dr. Otis Moss III calls theological biomimicry. Theological biomimicry, in which we see in the natural world a better way, in which we are reminded by the natural world of the shape of the world as God made it to be. A world shaped by love and by justice. To participate in the creation-wide lament that is even now pouring forth is to recognize our interdependence, to affirm our interconnectedness, and to step into a deeper solidarity with one another and with all of God's creatures. And it is precisely there, in that kind of boundary-crossing solidarity, that we begin to weave together those beautiful but frayed threads, the ones that hold us in right relationship with one another, with all of creation, and with God. Mourning together in true solidarity, we both name the truth of what's wrong and we begin to make it right. And friends, we, current and future religious leaders, can help with that project. We can create brave spaces for lament, spaces in which to speak aloud and listen to the truths that grief tells. We can build communities in which we learn how to practice solidarity with those who mourn, to honor the grief of those who weep. We can, in our preaching and praying, our rituals and our liturgies, expand the circle of compassion and concern to include the whole of what God made, human and non-human neighbors alike. And if we do that, even in part, then we will have begun together and with the help of God to weave anew that beautiful fabric that connects all of us, one to the other and all of us to God. And may it be so. Amen.